Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Foundation Paper Piecing. Welcome to my channel. Let's get started looking at this pattern I made for the 1955 Chevy Pickup Truck. There are a few tiny pieces here, pointing out one that's on the side window, and a few other very tiny pieces. Where those have happened, I've done my best to get the numbers in there, or if not, off to the side where you can see what number goes in which little tiny triangle. The tire sections on these vehicles are always my favorite. They're pretty easy to design just by cutting the wheel in half and then going in a circle around the wheel in two parts. One thing I like to do is color code in some meaningful way to myself my pattern. So I'm looking at the picture and I'm saying, okay, LG, that's light gray, DG, that's dark gray, W is white, B is black, and I've got two shades of blue, so I've got a light blue and a dark blue. This is the third vehicle I've assembled in my vehicle series of foundation paper piecing. I've done this 1960s era Mustang and a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. I've got enough of this Moda grunge fabric, basic gray, to do several more cars, and I've also got enough of the Midas Touch fabric that I'm using for the sky portion of these car blocks, and hopefully I'm going to have a unified 12 car quilt when all this is done. Here's a look at the fabric selections I'm using. I've got a fat quarter of light blue and dark blue. I've got that basic gray for the street and the lighter gray. I've got a black and that Midas Touch for the sky portion. The first thing I do when getting ready to assemble a foundation paper piece pattern is cut the pattern apart into the sections. For this section, I want to go ahead and show you how I cut out the fabric. For this piece, I need a little bit of light blue. So the important thing to remember when you're cutting out the individual pieces for each section of a foundation paper piece project, you want to make sure you've got seam allowance enough to cover the piece you're trying to cut out. And I cut mine extra large. This big centerpiece, I'm leaving plenty of room to stitch on additional pieces around the side. Now you'll notice my blue fabric is wrong side up and my pattern is right side up, and that's because we're sewing the paper, we're sewing to the back of the paper. So the pattern being right side up, the fabric goes on the back side of that paper, right side down. That was probably one of the hardest concepts for me when I started paper piecing. And like I said, I add plenty of wiggle room on cutting out the fabric for these pieces in the individual sections. Next, I lay these pieces down in numerical order on the sections. So I've got piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, piece 4, and piece 5. And I put those together with the section piece, and I'm ready to take those to the sewing machine when I get the rest of these sections cut out. With all the paper cut out, I'm going to go back and cut the fabric for each section, each piece within the section, and stack those up like the first one, so I am going to be ready to start stitching. I grabbed one of my little zipper cases to stack the sections up in. They were getting a little shifty on me, shifting around, so I thought it would be better to have them contained in a little zipper case. Here are a look at a couple of sections I'm going to put together a little bit more slowly. The one on the right has 3 pieces, and the one on the left had 4 pieces. I need a light gray and a black for pieces 1 and 2, and the easiest way to do those first 2 pieces, that's to place them right sides together on the back of my pattern, and I'm going to make sure they overlap that stitching line between piece 1 and piece 2. I can see by the light behind the paper that my pieces do overlap the stitch line, and the black piece will be pressed open to cover piece 2 of this section. My stitch length is about 1.3. I'm stitching a couple of stitches before my sewing line and a couple of stitches after my sewing line. I trim away threads, then I fold on my stitch line, trim away any excess bulk from the seam, and in this case there's not a lot, but I will trim away a little bit. In this case, I finger pressed my seam open. As the project gets larger, I will be using the iron to press those seams open, and make sure you're not using any steam until you're all done and there's no paper left. Now it's time to add piece 3 to this section. I will place this gray right sides together with the back of the project. I'm going to make sure that gray fabric overlaps the stitch line between piece 1 and 2 and piece 3, and it does. I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, I've got my stitch length set to 1.3. I'm stitching 1 or 2 stitches before the stitch line and 1 or 2 stitches after the stitch line. I will trim my threads. I will fold back the paper on my stitch line. I will trim away the excess bulk on that side of the stitch line. Then I can press piece 3 open. Let's go through another section a little bit more slowly, and this is a section that has 4 pieces. This piece of fabric has to account for the seam allowance going around that corner of the section. I can put the next piece right sides together, making sure I'm overlapping my stitch line. Then I can stitch that seam and press it open. Now checking that third piece, I can fold on the stitch line and I can see that there is that seam allowance overlap. The fourth piece for this section, you can tell I've kind of cut it out to the shape of the individual piece, and I do have that seam allowance overlap. I'm going to put this right sides with the back of the project, making sure that I've got an overlap for that stitch line, and that when I fold it open it's going the right direction. I can't tell you how many times I've stitched it to where, and then even cut away fabric that I needed because I placed it wrong. I placed it on the wrong side. Just make sure you're always pressing, or your fabric will fold away towards the bigger numbers. These pieces don't look like much yet, but when we trim them and assemble them, they're going to turn into this beautiful, beautiful project. I've got my iron set up nearby now because the next section I was going to do is this tire section. It's half of a tire. I'll likely be wanting to press after every additional piece. When you're talking about a section with 20 or 25 pieces, you really do need to press after every addition to keep everything straight. Here's a slower look at this tire section. This half a tire has a light gray for the center hub, and then we've got a white going around, then a dark gray going around, and last we'll have a black going around for the actual shadow of the tire. Here's a look at that section all finished. It hasn't been trimmed yet, but all the colors are there, and you can see the color of the truck. On the body of the truck is that light blue. Here's a look at a place where I missed stitching on piece number 10. I skipped right ahead to piece 11 and I didn't even notice that, but luckily for me it did not make a difference in the way it looked on the front, so I did not undo it and rip it out. Here's that mistake I make frequently. I stitched this gray fabric to the wrong side, so when folding it open, it covers what I already stitched. So I'm going to have to rip out the seam and fix this so it will fold open the correct way. All right, let's try this again. I need to put this right sides together and make sure the fold, when you fold it open, is going to go to the larger side, not the opposite way. Some of the sections only have one piece of fabric. I'm just going to set those aside for trimming up later. I like to put a piece of Scotch tape on those just to keep the fabric together with the pattern. Here's an example where I folded the fabric back and cut off what I had already stitched. So this is such a small section. Watch what I'm doing here. I'm just gently ripping my pattern away from this fabric and tossing it in the scrap heap. I'll put a little tape on my pattern to hold it together, and I'll just start over from scratch. Here's a case where I've got the exact same color next to each other on two different pieces on the same section. The reason I've got that is because I want the seam lines to echo the seams on the actual truck. I spent a couple of minutes pulling out usable scraps from the trimmings, and I did have a few, but not too many. Those will go into my crumbs bag. Let's talk a little bit about trimming the pieces. For this piece, it's got lots and lots of seams holding it all together, so I feel pretty comfortable just trimming this away with my scissors, and I'm trimming on the dotted line, which is my seam allowance, and the inner line going around the outside of the section is the stitch line. For sections that are large or do not have as many stitch lines to hold everything in place, I'll use my cutting mat and my rotary cutter with a ruler to trim the pieces. I like to put all my sections in alphabetical order so it'll be easier to find them when I'm ready to follow my assembly instructions. This truck pattern has a left section, a center section, and a right section that will eventually be joined together. But before we do that, we've got to assemble the left, center, and the right. For putting together foundation paper piece sections, I do use my clips a lot. In this case, I'm starting with E and F, and I can see how they go together on the truck, where they are on my pattern. Place these two little sections right sides together and stitch on the stitch line. I'm still stitching on paper here, so I'm going to leave my stitch length at 1.3. With those first two sections together, I can add the next section according to my instructions, and I'm going to keep following those instructions little by little to assemble this whole truck. I do like to remove any paper that's going to be encased into a third seam. So if there are two seams that I've joined together, that's fine. I can get to that paper, but once I sew that next seam, that's going to cover up some of the previous seam, and I try to get that particular paper out of the way. If it's a complicated foundation paper piece pattern, I also like to keep track on the pattern itself, on the instructions, as to what I've gotten done and where I'm at. Putting something like this together might take you more than a day, and you'll come back and forget where you were. It's easier if you mark your instructions as you go along. You'll want to take note of where certain things need to line up on your picture. In this case, I've got my blue just a little bit off, so I can see with the clip where that's going to actually stitch to, so I can adjust that piece, move it over just the tiniest bit, and then I'll see that it's going to line up perfectly when I stitch it. Sometimes I use a lot of clips to keep it all together. I prefer clips to pins for foundation piecing. And here we have the left section of the truck all done and ready to go. Here's a little look at how the cab of the truck came together for me for the center section. Now I've got enough done to put the left and the center together. You can see that my edges aren't exactly straight. There's a little bit of wonkiness happening, but thank goodness for the clips. We're going to get this clipped into place and we will get this stitched together so that it looks amazing. I assembled all the remaining sections into the right side of the truck, and then I got the right side of the truck stitched onto the main truck, and here is the finished result, this beautiful 14-inch wide by 9-inch tall 1955 Chevy truck. If you're interested in foundation paper piece and my patterns, please subscribe to this channel and click that bell icon to get all the notifications when I post a new video. That's not very often because, as you may or may not know, foundation paper piecing can be a little time consuming. If you're interested in other quilting projects, please check out my other channel. I'll leave a link in the description. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again soon.